both in terms of where precisely the money comes from and how it's determined, like which areas will get that money, and if there's sort of fighting between those regional groups, and also the structure in terms of how they conduct local governance and how the decisions are made. Is it in different places Syrians that are making the decision that they'll provide electricity or force women to wear niqab, or is it foreign elements that are making those decisions, and does that differ across regions?
I can't speak to where ISIS gets its money from, I don't know. But I know that when Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi made his statement about the formation of the Islamic State of Iraq and Asham, he said that almost half of Jabhat al-Nusra's money was coming from the Islamic State of Iraq. So that much is known. In terms of the foreigners, there are also Syrians within the Islamic State of Iraq and Asham. So it's not just a foreign thing. And it differs in different areas. In some places they have foreign emirs, and in other places they have Syrian emirs. So it's a very, it differs. When a lot of these places fell out of regime control, obviously other forms of order needed to sort of be imposed. In many cases, so in many areas we started to see Sharia courts come to the fore simply because this was a means to try and impose some form of order and to settle disputes and what have you. After a time, we saw them in some of these areas. They started to form Hay'a Shar'iyya, legislative association, if you like, and this was comprised of representatives from the different military units as well as civilians, and often they were elected to this kind of a board. In many of the cities and the towns, so they would be elected to this sort of Hay'a Shar'iyya, which would be responsible for trying to secure some of these services, for example. They'd try and negotiate this kind of stuff. In many places, ISIS sort of just took over now in the past 6 months and just took over and imposed its own views. With regard to the services, for example, particular brigades or battalions or military units, whatever you want to call them, would take it upon themselves to provide electricity via generators to certain areas. So it really does depend on the area.
Okay. Adnan, in the back here.
Adnan Zulfikar, I'm from the Truman National Security Project. I had a question about you talked about geographic identity, some groups coalescing around that, and then ideological as well. There have been some people who've thrown out this suggestion that sort of tribal affiliations may be a route similar to in Iraq to create sort of another force that may, challenge ISIS and some of these other groups. To what extent have you found people coalescing around tribal identity in your travels?
I wrote a story about this earlier this year. The Ba'ath system sort of broke the tribal structure. It broke the traditional pyramidal tribal structure with the sheikh at the apex, because it was a alternative source of power. It was a potential threat. So they sort of broke that traditional structure, unlike in Iraq, for example, and they would pick other sheikhs, other leaders who didn't have much clout in terms of the traditional tribal hierarchy, but who could get things done with the regime, with the system. So their clout increased.
Pre-revolution.
Yeah, this is pre. So their clout sort of increased because they were the guys who could get things done with the regime. Leaving the traditional tribal leaders sort of sidelined. In some areas, we're talking about the east mainly, because that tends to be, there is some talk about reconstituting, if you like, this traditional tribal, the traditional power of the tribal leader. It remains to be seen whether or not the Sahawat will come from the tribes, or whether they'll simply come from FSA groups and others who are angry at what ISIS is doing in their country. So it doesn't necessarily have to come from tribes, because the structure of, we're talking about a regime, a system of governance that over 40 years changed the structure of the tribes and the power dynamics within it. So, it doesn't necessarily have to come from that. replicate the Iraqi model.
But are the people falling back into old patterns, or we're just seeing new leaders emerging?
Well, that's a sad thing about civil wars, is that, especially ones that take on increasingly sectarian hue, is that people are sort of being driven into their base identity. People are being identified as Sunni or Alawi or from this clan or from whatever. And tribal affiliation can often mean the difference between whether or not you can freely enter an area, whether you can pass a checkpoint, things like that. So, people are sort of retreating into this identity, and they're also being forced back into it at the same time.
Okay, back here.
Hi, my name is Tanvi. I'm from the Medill School of Journalism. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the refugees. We know there's a crisis, in neighboring nations in Jordan and Lebanon, and they're kind of buckling under the, just the burden of that. But also Iraqi nationals who are stuck in Syria at the moment, or people from other countries who are kind of stuck in the midst of this proxy war, really, and have no means of getting out. And so, if you'd seen something, or if you've know anything about that, if you could maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the situation for Syrian refugees in neighboring countries is it's very different in different countries. In Turkey, for example, the government run camps, and they were established very early on in the summer of 2011, when we started to see the first camps in Turkey. In Lebanon, of course, the country doesn't allow official refugee camps. There's some talk that now they're allowing some to be formed, but for a number of reasons, mainly it's the historical, Lebanon's history with refugees, starting with the Palestinians. It's a political football. It's a very touchy issue, the issue of setting up camps for refugees. But having said that, there are more than 1 million Syrians, not all of them refugees, in a country of about 4 million people. So, and they're entering a society that has long been polarized over the issue of Syria. There have long been Lebanese who are pro-Assad, and there have long been Lebanese who are anti-Assad. And into this sort of, and they have their own issues. So into this kind of volatile mix, you can add 1 million Syrians who are coming with their own traumas and their own experience of war. So that's a very, very delicate situation. In Jordan as well, I think the number is, 700, 800,000 people. And there are camps for Syrian. There is, of course, the famous Zaatari camp, but only about 100,000 people are there. Most of the Syrians are finding homes in the urban centers. They're everywhere, and resentment is growing as well towards the Syrian population that is perceived as, taking jobs away from Jordanians, and also putting a huge stress on a country that is very water poor, which is a very big deal, and which is, has its own economic issues that it's trying to deal with. So, and in Iraq, of course, we saw this summer a massive influx of Syrians who basically walked into Iraq. So, each country has its own challenges with regard to the Syrian population. In addition to the Iraqis, who you mentioned, who were living in Syria, we also have the Palestinians, who have become, many of them have become refugees, either a second or a third time now in neighboring states, and they have a particular, issue as well.
So you were just in Jordan. What is the situation with Syrians? We've heard a lot about the hospitality of Jordan. We've also heard recently that there may be some border closures. Is it a free flow for refugees? What's the status of the situation? Is Jordan stretched too far?
Well, Jordan is definitely stretched, and my understanding is that there are tens of thousands of Syrians now are stranded on the Syrian side of the Jordanian border, waiting to get in. The Jordanians have built a bigger camp. It's bigger than Zaatari, and that they're hoping that they can get
on the Syrian side of the border.
No, it's on the Jordanian side of the border, and it's much bigger than Zaatari. So nobody thinks that these people are going to go home anytime soon.
Okay, here.
Thank you. I'd like your reaction on, or your comment on where we, the U.S. and its and the Western community should be going from, from this point. It's clear that the opposition is highly fragmented. I suspect that that is a result in part of an ideology, but also in a part also because, our reticence to provide support, has led some to gravitate towards more extreme elements, which in fact were gaining support. And that as a result, trying to, at this point, trying to visualize an opposition, which is strong enough to negotiate a final outcome, which is in some way an improvement over the pre-war situation, may not be realistic. At this point, therefore, should we be essentially trying to do that, or should we basically say, well, there's very little we can do, to influence the final outcome, and should be focusing our attention more just on the huge humanitarian crisis, both within Syria and in neighboring countries, which they, which has taken place in the last couple of years.
Well, once again, it's not my job to say what you should or should not do, but I will say that a lot of people, looked at Syria and they thought, oh, it's very complicated, it's too hard, what are we going to do? Well, the thing is that it's not going to get any easier. So if it was too hard 2 years ago and you weren't sure who to pick, it's not going to get any easier, it's only going to get more complicated.
So you haven't been inside Syria for a few months, but you've been to the camps in Jordan, you're living in Lebanon, you're talking to Syrians who are inside. Are people saying what they want to happen? I mean, what attitude